The sound of shattering glass was the first thing. The second was the silence that followed. Grace Zimmerman stared at the floor. Her mother's antique vase, her last link to a life back east, lay in 100 pieces. But she didn't care about the vase. Her hands were shaking for a different reason. They were shaking because of the letter. A single wrinkled piece of paper that had just destroyed her world. It was from the foreman of the cattle drive. It was about her husband, Daniel, and it said he wasn't coming home. May of 1872 had been cruel. Another month, another painful reminder that her womb was empty. 5 years of marriage, and nothing. 5 years of watching other women in town swell with new life while she remained barren. Now this. The letter said there was a stampede near the Kansas border. It said Daniel was gone, just like that. A random, senseless accident. Grace sank to her knees. The glass bit into her skin, but she didn't feel it. All she felt was the cold emptiness spreading through her chest. She was 26 years old, a widow, and she was utterly alone in the Montana wilderness. Winter was coming, and she had no one. Mrs. Zimmerman. A voice from the doorway, deep and familiar. She looked up, wiping tears from her face with the back of a bloody hand. "Sheriff Taylor, I heard about Daniel. Thought you might need some supplies." She pulled herself up, trying to hide the mess, trying to hide her face. "Come in, Sheriff." He stepped inside, his old eyes taking in the scene. The shattered vase, the blood on her dress. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she lied. "Just a small cut." He placed a sack of flour and coffee on her rough-hewn table. "Town took up a collection. It ain't much, but it'll help." "Thank you," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. The sheriff looked around the small cabin, at the life Daniel had built with his own 2 hands. "Winter's coming, Grace. A woman alone out here. Maybe it's time to think about heading back east. To your family." A fire sparked in her eyes. "I have no family," she said, her voice hard as iron. "Daniel built this place for us, for the children we were supposed to have. She wouldn't abandon it. She couldn't. This was all she had left of him. After he left, she watched the sun bleed across the mountains. She had thought the loneliness of a childless marriage was the worst pain she would ever know. She was wrong. This was so much worse. That night she didn't sleep. She just sat in the dark, clutching the rifle Daniel had taught her to use. The wilderness didn't care about her grief. It was always watching, always waiting for a moment of weakness. And Grace Zimmerman was determined not to show any. Days bled into weeks. Grace learned to live with the ghost of her husband. She sold off most of the cattle, keeping only a few she could manage. She chopped wood until her hands were raw. She worked from sunup to sundown, trying to exhaust herself so she wouldn't have to think. The townsfolk would ride out sometimes, bringing a bit of news or a helping hand. But as the first snows of November began to fall, the visits became fewer and farther between. The world was shrinking, closing in around her small, isolated ranch. She was truly on her own now. And then one morning, everything changed again. It was December. A bitter wind howled outside, and the snow was piled high against the cabin walls. She was awakened by the frantic whinnying of Thunder, Daniel's old horse. It was a sound of pure terror. Grace grabbed the rifle. She pulled her shawl tight and eased the cabin door open, peering into the gray dawn. And she saw him. A man lying face down in the snow just outside her gate. His horse stood over him, a dark shape against the endless white. He wasn't moving. She should have been scared. A lone woman, a strange man. Every instinct told her to bar the door and wait, but she didn't. She couldn't. She set the rifle down and ran, the icy air burning her lungs. "Sir, can you hear me?" She rolled him over. His face was young, but hard-worn, covered in a rough beard. And there was blood, a dark, ugly stain spreading in the snow beneath his side. He was alive, but just barely. A crimson trail marked her path as she dragged him, inch by painful inch, out of the snow and into the warmth of her cabin. She cut away his heavy coat and blood-soaked shirt. The wound was bad. A bullet hole, angry and infected. He was burning with fever. For 3 days and 3 nights, Grace fought for his life. She cleaned the wound, poured broth between his cracked lips, and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She was so tired, she kept dozing off in the chair beside the bed. On the 3rd day, he opened his eyes. They were a startling, piercing blue. "Am I dead?" he croaked. Grace jolted awake. "No, though you came close." She held a cup of water to his lips. "Who shot you?" He took a long, slow sip before answering. "Name's Deacon Vance, road agents, near Blackwater Pass. Took my money, but missed my heart." He tried to sit up, but winced and fell back. "Sorry to trouble you, ma'am." "Grace Zimmerman," she said. "And it's no trouble. I couldn't just leave you to freeze." But as he lay there, a complete stranger in her husband's bed, a new kind of fear began to creep in. She had saved his life. But what if she had just invited death into her home? Deacon Vance, as he called himself, was a puzzle. As he slowly healed, he talked about his life. A former cavalry soldier, he said. Now a drifting cowboy looking for work. His story was simple, almost too simple. Grace found herself watching him. The way his eyes were always moving, scanning the windows, the door, the way he never sat with his back to the room. He wasn't just a cowboy. He was a man on the run. One evening, by the fire, he asked the question she'd been dreading. "Your husband won't mind me staying till I can ride, will he?" Grace stared into the flames. "My husband died last spring, a cattle drive accident." Deacon was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Zimmerman." "Please," she said, looking up at him, "call me Grace." His eyes were full of a strange gentleness, an understanding that made her stomach flutter. "It's just me here now." And that was the truth. It was just the two of them, a widow and a wounded stranger, trapped together by the snow. As soon as he could walk, Deacon insisted on working. He mended the leaky roof, fixed the broken porch step, and chopped a mountain of firewood. He was strong and capable, and Grace found herself relying on him more and more. His presence filled the silence that had haunted the cabin for months. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts. But whenever she asked about the robbery, his answers were vague. He would change the subject, or his eyes would get that distant, haunted look again. He was hiding something, something big. By Christmas, he was strong enough to ride into town for supplies. Grace gave him her last bit of money, her heart pounding as she watched him disappear over the snowy ridge. A part of her was sure he would never come back. Why should he? He was a drifter. He owed her nothing. But he did come back. He returned with flour and coffee, but also with a small pine tree tied to the back of his saddle and a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, a smile touching her lips for the first time in months. "It's Christmas," he said simply. "Thought you could use some cheer." That night he gave her the package. Inside was a beautiful, soft blue woolen scarf. "How did you—" she started. "Traded my father's old pocket watch," he admitted, looking almost shy. "It was worth it to see you smile." Her heart did a strange little flip. She gave him the shirt she had secretly sewn for him. As their hands touched, a current passed between them, warm and dangerous. The air grew thick with unspoken words. But the quiet comfort of their makeshift home was about to be shattered. One night in January, the wolves came, Grace was woken by the terrifying sound of thunder screaming in the stable, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. Deacon's rifle. She didn't even think. She grabbed Daniel's shotgun, her hands steady, and ran outside into the freezing moonlight. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. Deacon stood in the middle of the yard, a ring of shadows circling him. 3 wolves, their eyes glowing in the dark. A 4th lay dead in the snow nearby. "Grace, get back inside!" he yelled, never taking his eyes off the predators. But she wasn't the same woman who had crumpled to the floor 6 months ago. She raised the shotgun, aimed, and fired. The blast echoed through the valley, sending 2 of the wolves scattering into the woods. Deacon's rifle took care of the 3rd. In the sudden, ringing silence, they stared at each other. "That was foolish," he said, his voice rough as he walked towards her. "You could have been killed." "So could you," she shot back, her heart still hammering against her ribs. "I couldn't just stay inside while you—" She trailed off, suddenly aware of how close he was, the heat coming off his body, the intensity in his gaze. "While I what?" he asked, his voice soft now. "While you face them alone," she whispered. He reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair from her cheek. His touch was gentle, electric. "I'm not used to anyone caring whether I live or die." "Well, I care," she said, her voice shaking. And then he kissed her. It was a kiss born of fear and relief, and a loneliness so deep it ached. It was a kiss that changed everything. When they broke apart, breathless, he looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers. "I should go," he said, but he didn't move. "Stay," she whispered, holding onto his arm. That night she wasn't a widow. She was just a woman. And in his arms she felt a flicker of life she thought had been extinguished forever. But as she lay beside him in the dark, a cold sliver of guilt twisted in her gut. "I loved my husband," she whispered to the ceiling. "I know," Deacon said, his voice a low rumble beside her. "Loving him doesn't mean you can't love again." "Is that what this is?" she asked, feeling small and vulnerable. "Love." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you, Grace. If that's not love, then I don't know what is." But a single thought kept repeating in her mind. She had just given her heart to a man who wouldn't even tell her his real story. A man who was still a stranger. And strangers in the Montana territory often had secrets that could get you killed. As the winter snows began to melt, something shifted in Grace. A new hope, fragile and terrifying, began to take root. Her monthly courses, always so punctual, were late. At first she told herself it was just the stress, the strange winter. She'd been down this road with Daniel so many times, the flicker of hope, the weeks of waiting, the crushing disappointment. She couldn't go through that again. So she said nothing to Deacon. She kept her secret hidden, a tiny ember of possibility she was terrified to fan into a flame. But then the morning sickness started. One evening in April, as they sat on the porch, she knew she couldn't hide it any longer. "Deacon," she began, her hands trembling in her lap, "I have something to tell you." He turned, his expression serious. "I'm with child," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. He just stared at her. For a heartbeat she thought he was angry or scared. Then a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, lighting up his eyes. "A baby? Grace, are you sure?" She nodded, tears welling up. "As sure as I can be." In one swift movement, he was on his knees in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Grace Zimmerman, I've been trying to find the right time to ask you this. I reckon there's no better time than now. Will you marry me?" Joy, pure and overwhelming, washed away all her fears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." They were married in the town church in May, exactly 1 year to the day she had learned of Daniel's death. The town gossips whispered about the hasty wedding and the slight swell of her belly, but Grace didn't care. For the first time in a long, long time, she felt happy. But their newfound happiness was fragile, and it was about to be tested. A week after the wedding, Sheriff Taylor rode out to the ranch. He wasn't there for a friendly visit. He dismounted slowly, his eyes fixed on Deacon. "I was just going through some old wanted posters from the marshal's office," he said, his voice flat. "Funny thing, I found one that looks an awful lot like you, Deacon." He held up the poster. The drawing was rough, but the eyes were unmistakable. The name on the poster wasn't Deacon Vance, it was Caleb Stone, wanted for desertion from the U.S. Army, and for murder. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Grace stared at the man she had just married, the father of her unborn child. He wasn't who he said he was. He was a wanted man, a killer. "It's not what you think," Caleb said, his voice strained. He looked at Grace, his eyes pleading. "Grace, I can explain." But how could he explain this? The poster offered a $500 reward, enough money to make a man risk a trip through a winter storm, enough money to make a sheriff ride all the way out to a remote ranch. "You have a choice, son," the sheriff said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You can come with me now, or I can come back with a posse. Either way, you're coming with me." Grace felt the cold dread wash over her. Her new life, her baby, her happiness, it was all built on a lie. She had run from one tragedy, only to find herself trapped in another. And this time, she might not survive it. "Let him explain," Grace said, her voice shaking but firm. She stood between Caleb and the sheriff, her hand protectively on her stomach. Sheriff Taylor hesitated, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "Grace, this man is a wanted murderer." "My name is Caleb Stone," he said, his voice low and heavy with regret. "And I am a deserter, but I am not a murderer." He looked at Grace, his soul bare in his eyes. "Everything I told you about my past was a lie. I had to run. I had to hide." He took a deep breath. "The man I'm accused of killing, his name was Captain Miller. He was my commanding officer. But he wasn't a good man. He was skimming supplies, selling them on the black market, starving his own men. When I found out, I confronted him. We fought. He pulled a gun. It went off. It was self-defense, Grace. I swear it." "A likely story," the sheriff grumbled, but he didn't draw his weapon. "After it happened, I panicked," Caleb continued. "I knew they'd never believe a private over a captain. They'd hang me. So I ran. I've been running ever since. I changed my name, drifted from town to town. I was heading north, as far away as I could get, when—" He trailed off. "When you got shot," Grace finished for him. "It wasn't road agents, was it?" He shook his head. "It was bounty hunters. They recognized me from a poster in the last town. They chased me for 2 days. I thought I'd lost them in Blackwater Pass, but they ambushed me. They took my horse, my gun, and left me for dead." It all clicked into place. The furtive glances, the fear in his eyes, the vague stories. He wasn't a predator. He was prey. "Sheriff," Grace said, turning to the old lawman, "you've known me my whole time in this territory. You knew my husband. Do I seem like a woman who would marry a cold-blooded killer?" Sheriff Taylor looked from Grace's determined face to Caleb's desperate one. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "The poster is from 3 years ago. If you were a killer, you'd have likely killed again by now. And those bounty hunters, they're vultures. They shoot first and ask questions later." He looked Caleb square in the eye. "I'm going to give you a chance. I'll write to the territorial judge. Tell him I have you in my custody. I'll tell him you're cooperating. But if you run, Caleb Stone, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Caleb nodded, a wave of relief washing over his face. I'm not running anymore. After the sheriff left, an uneasy silence settled over the cabin. Grace's mind was reeling. The man she loved had lied to her from the very beginning. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you'd turn me in. Or worse, that you'd make me leave. Grace, finding you. It was like finding a reason to live again. I didn't want to lose that." She looked at him, at the man who had fought wolves for her, who had put a smile back on her face, who had given her the child she had always dreamed of. He had lied, yes, but he had also saved her. "We're in this together now, Caleb," she said, taking his hand. "Whatever happens." But their troubles were far from over, because wanted posters don't just disappear. And bounty hunters aren't the only people who read them. Someone else was coming for Caleb Stone, someone far more dangerous than a posse of lawmen. And they were coming for something more than just a bounty. Life settled into a tense new normal. Every rider on the horizon, every unfamiliar sound in the night, sent a jolt of fear through Grace. Caleb never strayed far from the cabin. He was a prisoner on his own land. The summer passed in a haze of heat and anxiety. Grace's belly grew, a constant hopeful reminder of what was at stake. They were fighting not just for Caleb's freedom, but for their family's future. In late September, Sheriff Taylor rode out again. He looked grim. "Got a letter back from the judge," he said, handing it to Caleb. "He's willing to hear your case, but he wants you brought to Helena for trial." Helena was a week's ride away, a dangerous journey for a man with a price on his head. "And there's more," the sheriff said, his voice low. "The bounty on you has been doubled. Someone renewed the poster and added their own money to it. Someone wants you found. Badly." A cold knot formed in Grace's stomach. This wasn't just about the army anymore. Captain Miller, he must have had powerful friends, or family. "When do we leave?" Caleb asked, his face set like stone. "Soon as Grace has the baby," the sheriff replied. "It's too risky for her to travel now. I'll stay out here with you both until then, just in case." The sheriff's presence was a comfort, but it also turned their home into a fortress. They took turns on watch through the night. Grace cleaned rifles and counted cartridges, her hands moving with a grim purpose. This was the life she had chosen, a life of love and a life of fear. On a crisp October morning, her labor began. It was long and difficult, but with the help of the midwife from town and Caleb's steady presence, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Elizabeth. Holding her daughter for the first time, Grace felt a fierce, protective love that eclipsed all fear. She would do anything to keep this child safe. Caleb was a natural father. He cradled Elizabeth like she was made of spun glass, whispering promises to her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. For 2 weeks, they lived in a bubble of exhausted, joyful peace. The threat from the outside world seemed to fade away. Then, one night, the dog started barking. A frantic, incessant sound that meant only one thing: trouble. Sheriff Taylor grabbed his rifle. "Caleb, get Grace and the baby into the cellar. Don't come out until I say so." From the window, they could see them. 4 riders, silhouetted against the rising moon. They weren't a posse. They moved with a silent, deadly precision. "It's them," Caleb whispered, his face pale. "The bounty hunters." "Or worse," the sheriff muttered. "Get moving, now!" Caleb pulled Grace towards the trapdoor in the floor. "Grace, you have to go." "No!" she cried, clutching Elizabeth tighter. "I'm not leaving you." "There's no time to argue," he hissed. Suddenly, the front window shattered, and a shot rang out, embedding itself in the wall just above their heads. This wasn't a capture. It was an execution. Caleb shoved her towards the cellar. "I love you," he yelled over the sound of another gunshot. "Now go!" He and the sheriff began returning fire, the small cabin erupting into a war zone. Grace scrambled down the ladder into the dark, musty cellar, her baby girl wailing in her arms. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut, plunging them into blackness. Above her, the floorboards shook with the thunder of guns and the crash of breaking furniture. She could hear men shouting, the sheriff yelling orders, Caleb's determined replies. She sat in the dark, tears streaming down her face, rocking her baby and praying. She had found love again, only to have it ripped away by violence. She had finally gotten the child she yearned for, only to have her born into a world of chaos and death. The gunfire seemed to go on for an eternity. Then suddenly, it stopped. A terrifying silence fell over the house. Grace held her breath, straining to hear something, anything. A footstep, a voice. But there was nothing, just the frantic beating of her own heart and the soft whimpers of her child. Who had won? Was her husband dead? Was the sheriff? Were the bounty hunters now searching the house for her? Slowly, carefully, she pushed open the trap door. The smell of gunpowder and smoke hit her like a physical blow. The cabin was a wreck. The windows were shattered. The table was overturned, and the floor was littered with spent casings. And there was blood. 2 bodies lay on the floor, men she didn't recognize. Bounty hunters. Sheriff Taylor was slumped against the wall, a dark stain spreading across his chest, but he was alive. He gave her a weak, grim smile. "We got him, Grace." But where was Caleb? She saw him then, standing on the porch, his rifle still in his hands, staring out into the night. He was wounded, a deep gash on his forehead, but he was standing. He was alive. But he wasn't looking at the 2 dead men in the yard. He was looking at a 5th man, the leader, who was on his knees, his hands raised in surrender. And it was the leader's words that froze Grace's blood in her veins. "You don't understand," the man rasped, spitting blood. "It ain't about the army bounty anymore. It's about him, Mr. Abernathy." Caleb went still. "Who is Mr. Abernathy?" "He's Captain Miller's father," the man sneered. "And he's one of the richest, most powerful cattle barons in the territory. He knows you're here. He knows about the woman. He put the new bounty on you. He wants you dead, and he doesn't care who he has to go through to make it happen." This was never going to end. They couldn't run. Abernathy had money, and he had men. He would hunt them forever. Caleb turned and looked at Grace, his face a mask of despair. He had brought this danger to her door. He had put her and their newborn child in the crosshairs of a vengeful madman. "Grace," he said, his voice cracking, "you have to take Elizabeth and go. Go back east. Forget you ever met me." She walked towards him, her steps certain, her gaze unwavering. She stood before him, the mother of his child, his partner in this bloody mess. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong in the cold night air. "This is our home. He's not taking it from us. He's not taking you from me. We're going to fight." The man on the ground laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Fight? Lady, you have no idea who you're dealing with. Abernathy will burn this place to the ground with you inside." Grace looked down at him, her eyes as cold and hard as the Montana winter. "Then we'll be ready for him." They didn't have much time. Sheriff Taylor, his arm in a sling, helped them prepare. They buried the dead bounty hunters in an unmarked grave and sank their wagon in the creek. They couldn't go to the law. Abernathy owned the law. This was their fight, and theirs alone. "He'll come with 12 men, maybe more," the sheriff warned. "He'll try to burn you out." So they prepared for a siege. Caleb and the sheriff boarded up the windows, leaving only small slits for their rifles. Grace carried buckets of water from the well, soaking the cabin walls and the roof. She stockpiled food, medicine, and ammunition in the cellar. Every action was deliberate, a prayer against the coming storm. They waited. The days were filled with a tense, suffocating silence. The nights were worse. Every gust of wind, every snap of a twig sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Grace barely slept, sitting in the dark with Elizabeth cradled in one arm and Daniel's old shotgun in the other. She looked at Caleb, his face grim and tired in the flickering lamplight, and saw the weight of his guilt. "This is my fault," he whispered one night. "I should never have come here." "If you hadn't come here, I'd be dead or frozen," she said fiercely. "And Elizabeth would never have been born." "You didn't bring this on us, Caleb. A wicked man did, and we're going to stop him." The attack came at dawn, a week later. A single shot rang out, shattering the morning calm. It was a signal. Then the horizon was filled with riders, at least 15 of them, fanning out to surround the small ranch house. Leading them was a man on a magnificent black horse. He was older, with a cruel face and eyes that burned with hatred. Mr. Abernathy. "Caleb Stone!" Abernathy's voice boomed across the yard. "You took my son from me. I'm here to collect the debt. Throw down your guns and come out, and I'll let the woman and the child live." "He's lying," the sheriff grunted from his position at the window. "He won't leave any witnesses." "I know," Caleb said. He looked at Grace, a world of love and fear in his eyes. Then he raised his rifle to the firing slit. "This ends today, one way or another." The first wave of gunfire erupted, peppering the cabin with bullets. Wood splintered, and the air filled with smoke. Grace, her heart pounding, stayed low, shielding Elizabeth with her own body. This was it, the battle for their lives. For hours they held them off. Caleb, the sheriff, and Grace fought like cornered animals. She reloaded rifles for the men, her hands moving quickly and surely. When one of Abernathy's men tried to sneak up to the porch with a torch, she fired the shotgun through the door, sending him screaming back into the yard. They were outnumbered, but they had cover, and they had something to fight for. But Abernathy was relentless. He sent his men in waves, slowly chipping away at their defenses. The sheriff took another bullet, this one in the leg. He was losing blood fast. Caleb's rifle was running low on ammunition. It was hopeless. They were going to die here. Then, through the haze of smoke and chaos, Grace saw it. Abernathy's men were bringing up a wagon, and in the back of the wagon was a barrel, kerosene. They were going to burn them out after all. "Caleb!" she screamed. "The wagon!" He saw it too. Desperation clawed at him. He was out of options. "Grace, take Beth to the cellar. Bar the door, no matter what you hear." "What are you going to do?" she cried. He didn't answer. He just kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss. Then he turned to the sheriff. "Give me cover." Before Grace could stop him, he kicked open the front door and ran out into the yard, firing his pistol as he went. It was a suicide run, a desperate, hopeless charge. He was drawing their fire, giving her and Elizabeth a chance. Abernathy laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. "Fool!" he roared, raising his own rifle. But Caleb wasn't running towards Abernathy's men. He was running towards the stable, towards Thunder. In a flash, he was on the horse's back, kicking him into a gallop. He charged not away from the fight, but straight towards the wagon with the kerosene. He fired his last 2 shots into the barrel. The world erupted in a ball of fire. The explosion threw Grace back from the doorway. The force of it shook the very foundations of the cabin. She scrambled to her feet, her ears ringing, and looked out at a scene from hell. The wagon was gone. 2 of Abernathy's men were on the fire, screaming. The others were in disarray, their horses rearing in terror. And in the middle of it all, Mr. Abernathy lay on the ground, his fine clothes smoldering, his magnificent horse lying dead beside him. But where was Caleb? She saw him, lying near the burning wreckage, unmoving. No, she breathed. No, no, no. Ignoring the remaining gunmen, ignoring the risk, she ran. She ran across the blood-soaked fiery yard and fell to her knees beside him. He was alive, but his body was broken and burned. One of Abernathy's men, his face a mask of rage, raised his pistol to finish them both off. But before he could fire, a new sound cut through the air. A volley of rifle shots, not from the cabin, but from the ridge behind them. A posse, the townsfolk. The sheriff must have sent for help before the fight began. Abernathy's remaining men threw down their guns and surrendered. It was over. Grace cradled Caleb's head in her lap, her tears falling on his burned face. "Stay with me, Caleb," she sobbed. "Please don't leave me." He opened his eyes, his breathing shallow. "Grace," he whispered, is the baby safe?" "She's safe," Grace choked out. "We're all safe, thanks to you." A faint smile touched his lips. "Good," he murmured, and then his eyes closed. They carried him back inside. The town doctor, who had come with the posse, worked on him for hours. His leg was shattered. He had 3 broken ribs, and the burns were severe. It was a miracle he was alive at all. "He's strong," the doctor said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But the next few days will tell the tale." The territorial judge arrived 2 days later. He listened to the sheriff's story, to Grace's testimony, and to the confession of one of Abernathy's captured men. The truth of Captain Miller's corruption, Abernathy's vengeful siege, and Caleb's innocence was finally laid bare. All charges against Caleb Stone were dropped. He was a free man. But his biggest fight was just beginning. For weeks, he drifted in and out of consciousness, battling infection and fever. Grace never left his side. She held his hand, bathed his brow, and whispered stories of the future they would have, of the children they would raise in the house he had saved. Slowly, miraculously, he began to heal. By the time the first snows of the new winter fell, he was sitting up in bed, holding his daughter. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, and the scars from the fire would never fade. But he was alive, and he was home. Their life was never the same. The siege became a local legend, a story of how a lone widow and a wanted man stood up to a cattle baron and won. The Vance Ranch, they decided to keep Grace's name for it, was rebuilt, bigger and stronger than before. They had more children. Twin boys, James and Thomas, and another girl they named Hope. The cabin that had once been a symbol of Grace's loneliness became a sprawling ranch house, filled to the brim with noise, life, and laughter. Caleb never forgot the past, but he didn't let it define him. He taught his sons to be strong and fair, and his daughters to be brave and resilient. Grace found a happiness she never thought possible, a love forged in fire and fear, stronger than she could have ever imagined. Years later, sitting on the porch watching her grandchildren play in the same yard where she had once fought for her life, she would sometimes touch the faint scars on Caleb's hands. Each one was a reminder that sometimes the greatest love doesn't come from a fairy tale. It comes from surviving the nightmare together. It was a reminder that the sound of shattering glass wasn't an end. For her, it had been a beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the strange and suspenseful.